Welcome to Module 2, which is going to be on valuation. We're having one of our first beautiful spring days here in Geneva, so we've decided to come outdoors. But before we get into the actual material, I just want to make a quick link back to the trade-off game that you played at the beginning of Module 1. You perhaps recall how you were given units of value associated with each layer of information. There were no actual metrics associated with them each, and you weren't told either how we came up with those numbers. So the whole purpose of this module is to help appreciate just how important, but also complicated, it is to do proper valuation. To lead us in this discussion, we're lucky to have Professor Salvatore Di Falco from the University of Geneva, who's an environmental economist, and he's going to give you an idea of what the main take-home messages of this module are going to be.
My aim is basically to have at least a two objective math. The first objective is to provide the students with a vocabulary. Simply knowing what things are, what they're named, and their definitions. The second and probably most important objective is to provide the students with an overview, a critical overview of all the methods, and give them an idea of when things should be applied and when things should not be applied.
Excellent. We're going to organize this module just like all the other modules. We're going to start with a little bit of theory presented by Pavan Sukhdev of TEEB along with Salvatore. Then we're going to have some case studies and we're going to have some interviews as well to complement it before the evaluation period. Enjoy.
What's valuation? So what do you value? Yeah, you value your friends, your family. You value a beautiful sunny day like this in Geneva. You value other things about nature. Well, of course, you value your house, your car. You value a number of things. It's a human institution. And of late, we found that the need to value nature and its services, what we call ecosystem services, has become quite an interesting new area to be explored by policymakers, by businesses, and by NGOs. That's the kind of valuation we're talking about, which is also a self-reflection, because looking at the value of what nature provides to us, mostly which is free, is also a way for us to understand how we distance ourselves from nature and how we need to reconnect, perhaps using the means of valuation as a formal mechanism. Before we get into the valuation, we must understand the purpose of valuation, in other words, the why of valuation. And when we do that, we also realize that actually the purpose of valuation determines the valuation. For example, let us say you're in India and you're looking at the flow of nutrients and fresh water from the Nepal mountains into the state of Bihar. That's a valuable service, but at the same time, there's also soil erosion there, and there are occasional floods, and that destroys value. And you are, for example, trying to negotiate between two countries a payment for ecosystem services agreement. Well, if you were India, you would say all we see is damage from floods. If you were Nepal, we'd say all we provide is nutrients and fresh water. And actually, you would come to different values if you were negotiating, compared to what both countries might come to if we were merely adjusting national accounts for ecosystem services. So depending on the purpose, whether it's national accounting adjustments or whether it's domestic agreements for paying for ecosystem services or whether it's cross-border agreements, you might come up with different valuation approaches. Valuation also has serious ethical implications. This is not only about the complexity of nature, because we hardly understand the processes of nature. When we do, we don't necessarily identify and understand the functions, the things that nature does, and how those functions deliver value to us, ecosystem services, or indeed how they should be valued. There's many layers of uncertainty and risk when we value. But perhaps another dimension of that risk and uncertainty is understanding the local context, the societal context, the community context. Who should value? We said that valuation is a human institution, but who should value is a question. Should it be the government? Should it be the local communities? Should it be an independent third party? These are ethical issues. It's very difficult to push upon a local community a way of valuation that doesn't belong to it, especially when it, the community, is the one who literally lives in that natural area. And finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, the whole idea that we can engage valuation as we have defined it itself is an ethical issue, because it presumes a certain way of thinking. It presumes a kind of Judeo-Christian approach to nature, which is that we are distinct from nature. We are the agent of valuation, whoever we may be, and we can apply certain principles and norms and methods and science and come to an answer. Well, others might argue with that. A local community might say, who are you to presume so much? Who are you to disconnect us from the nature which is part of our home and of which we are part of existence? That kind of valuation is intuitive. It doesn't require a Cartesian approach. So taking the idea that you can value itself creates a certain risk that you may assume in a long-term basis that somehow or the other you can make and determine these choices, which may not be appropriate for a different community, or indeed may turn out to be dangerous for society. So in summary, valuation is a human institution. Who values matters. You need to define the purpose of valuation. In other words, you must know why to value. You need to recognize risks and uncertainties, because that is about the ethics of valuation. You need to identify the further risk and uncertainty, which is the ethical choice of the discount rate. And finally, you need to recognize that in engaging the process of valuation, you are already making a kind of ethical trade-off, because you are accepting a Cartesian, Judeo-Christian approach, which may or may not be appropriate for another community at another time in another place. The project, The Economics for Ecosystems and Biodiversity, pulled together a lot of knowledge on the issue of valuation, how to use it, when to use it, and what were the implications for policymakers, businesses, and citizens. Here's how TEEB views valuation, which is really in 3 tiers: recognizing value, demonstrating value, and capturing value. You can recognize value merely by being a human being. There's no need for economics. For instance, tribal communities would recognize the value of the forest in which they reside. They would probably associate a spiritual value as well, because they see their ancestors as living there. Last century, several areas were declared as protected areas in the US and in the UK, places like Yosemite National Park in the US or the Yorkshire Downs in the UK. And that was done on the basis that it was for posterity. It was part of the culture to preserve what we could see for future generations. No economics were considered. It was just recognizing value and enshrining it in legislation. Demonstrating value, however, does require some economic calculus. It does require some reference to the knowledge of economics. And finally, when we say capturing value, that's about transferring a payment from one party to the other. Someone pays, someone receives. So these are all forms of value and valuation. And if we notice, each of these forms of valuation will have typical responses. For instance, when you're recognizing value, the typical responses would be potentially a change in regional plan, such as was done by Baoqing County in China, when they decided that certain areas of the county were rich in ecosystem services as measured by the INVEST software, and they decided to reserve those for the purpose of providing ecosystem services and use other areas for development purposes. You can also recognize value when you have a change in legislation, such as the Philippines, after the 1998 bleaching event for coral reefs, decided to reserve around the Tubataha coral reef an area which became the no-go zone, which after a few years was found to have developed an increase in coral cover as a result of protecting it from intrusion, and was found to have increased the supply of fish almost fourfold compared to other regional areas. These were all ways of legislating, and in fact what happened as a result of that, further legislation increased the protected area through a buffer zone around it. You can also demonstrate value, and an example of that would be the value of a protected area, such as happened in the case of the city of Kampala and its neighboring swamp, the Nakivubo swamp, which was servicing effectively the city of Kampala as a natural sewage treatment plant because of the natural disintegration of human waste that went into that. An economist had calculated that if the city proceeded with its plans of converting that into agricultural and residential areas, then that would be at a huge cost of more than a couple of $1 million per annum that the city would have had to pay to create an alternative sewage treatment plant. Well, that's an example of valuing one service of the protected area and then making a change in legislation, because as a result of this evaluation, the swamp was in fact turned into a conservation zone. An example of certification is such as took place in Japan, where rice that was grown in a conservation area called white stalk rice, because it was helping conserve the areas where the white stalk, which was locally extinct in Toyooka City, had been reintroduced. As a result of this conservation practice of higher biodiversity rice growing, the farmers were able to realize a higher value for the rice. The support of the certification agency was vital because that helped the rice sell at a higher price. And of course, in addition to the certification, there was also a payment for ecosystem service that had been introduced by the local authority, which rewarded the farmers for the practice of converting their normal rice culture into a more organic rice culture, which allowed the feed of the white stalks to take hold. So these are different ways in which valuation elicits typical responses. And you will notice that, in fact, I haven't yet discussed a market response. And that's indeed true, because markets are really one form of response which are quite rare in the world of ecosystems and biodiversity. Fundamentally, this is because most of ecosystems and most of biodiversity are in the realm of public goods. These are public goods and services which nature provides to all of humanity for free, typically. And it's quite difficult to suggest that the first thing one should jump to solve the problems of ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss is actually a market solution. You will see that out of the 120 odd solutions, for instance, that are listed in the various TEEB reports, hardly a handful, less than 10, have anything to do with markets. On the other hand, the solutions that have been demonstrated show that valuation and the use of economic argument, demonstration, and capture, in fact, is quite a useful way of achieving what we want. The purpose of valuation ultimately is about conserving ecosystems and protecting biodiversity. What is monetization? Whenever we engage a conversation on valuation, it would be unusual for us not to engage at the same time some discussion on monetization. But then we need to ask and answer the question, what is monetization? Because it has different meanings in different contexts. If you were a central banker, monetization means the process of printing legal tender, coins, banknotes, and demonetization means extracting them, removing them from circulation. If you were an entrepreneur, monetization probably means the process of taking a patent and converting it to something valuable, patent monetization. Or it might be making use of data, designing a process that gives you the ability to make profit from data, data monetization. Or it might be some form of monetization of public goods, which so far did not deliver profits, only delivered public value. And you have, for example, got yourself a mining license, which then enables you to have monetized a public good, which was earlier part of the government's wealth. So there are all of these different types of monetizations. But there's yet a third dimension or a third definition of monetization, which is what comes into play when we talk valuation. And that's about ascribing monetary values, ascribing economic quantities to what natures deliver in terms of ecosystem services and biodiversity. That's the kind of monetization that we are talking about. When we talk about monetization, invariably there will be some discussion of some big number. And I often wonder why we are so obsessed with big numbers. Let me take an example. In 1997, Professor Bob Costanza and some scientists published in Nature an estimate of the monetary value of ecosystem services around the world. The answers were staggering. They were in the range of 18 to 61 trillion US dollars, and the mean was about $38 trillion, coming something like 24 trillion from ecosystem services in the ocean and another 14 trillion from ecosystem services on land. More recently, in 2014, Costanza and others put together a revised estimate, of course accounting for the increased scarcity and the increases in inflation. No surprises, the numbers were even bigger. Now we are talking about $125 trillion to $145 trillion of economic value every year from ecosystem services. But what does all this mean? Yes, it means that these values that are delivered from nature to society are bigger than what we call GDP. Global GDP has been in the range of the 20s and the 60s of trillions of dollars during these periods. But what else does it mean? Because to be honest, there is no one at the global level who can make decisions about this valuation. There is no president of the planet. And trust me, I have spent some time with the United Nations. It is hugely complex to get 193 nations to deliver a decision on anything, let alone something as complex as the value of global ecosystem services. So these big numbers can be interesting, but not very useful sometimes. Another example of a large global number was the cost-benefit analysis that was done by Andrew Bamford, a Cambridge scientist, and some others in 2002. Bamford and his team estimated that the benefits of converting 15% of land into protected areas and 30% of the oceans into protected areas in terms of measurable, valuable ecosystem services would be of the order of $4.4 to $5.2 trillion. And at the same time, they measured the costs of such a conversion into protected areas, which included, of course, the opportunity cost of the land that has preempted from other uses. They measured that cost as being 45 billion US dollars per annum. In other words, their conclusion was that the benefits exceeded the costs of such action by as much as 100 to 1. Now, you might argue that's pretty remarkable for a big number and an amazing use of monetization, and yet it has taken more than a decade to reach through the Convention on Biological Diversity to achieve smaller collective conservation targets, respectively 10 and 17% on land and on the oceans. So just the virtue of having a big global number doesn't necessarily translate into policy action or business decisions, and I think that's part of the challenge. For monetization to be truly useful, it needs to look much more at a local level, at a much more reflective level where communities, businesses, towns, cities are involved. Now let us look at some of the issues surrounding monetization, which sometimes can become quite controversial. I find that the reason why there are concerns is because there are certain assumptions that we have made, perhaps reflecting our education, where we tend to equate valuation with pricing, pricing with commodification, and commodification with privatization. But the reality is that I think this is partly an educational defect, because valuation is not pricing. A value is what you receive. A price is what you pay. If what you receive is from nature, the chances are that it's free. Therefore, by definition, it's got no price. It hasn't been transacted in markets. Markets only transact private claims. That's the way it is. Markets are no good for transacting, because you can't, public goods. Another issue is, when we look at pricing, does that necessarily mean immediately commodification? Let's take an example. Water pricing can be introduced. Any sensible government which is restricted in its resources for water would probably introduce 3 tiers of water pricing. One for drinking, which should be cheap and available to all. Another for agriculture, which should be perhaps more expensive, but yet available largely. And maybe a third for industry and luxury, such as swimming pools and factories, where you can apply some kind of a market-related price. But that pricing is a very complex range of different prices of what is essentially a public good managed by the government on behalf of its citizens. It hasn't necessarily led to the commodification of the commodity, so to speak, even though it is a commodity, of fresh water, because of the way it's been managed. And it hasn't automatically led to the market. And even if something is commodified, you need to first privatize it in order for it to be traded in markets, and that's another choice that has to be made. So you see, going from the language and the context of valuation to the language and context of pricing, which could be public pricing or it could be private pricing, to go from there to commodification, and then from there to marketization and privatization, because it's only private goods that trade in markets. These are discrete, separate steps. And the question to be asked is, who should take them? These are not individual choices. These are societal choices. And once again, these are ethical choices. To go from one to the other, to the other, to the other, you need to make 3 or 4 separate ethical choices as a society or as a community. It's not that you can jump automatically from valuation to privatization. Measuring things in monetary terms actually adds to the complexity. And some of the aspects of the complexity can be forgotten in the overemphasis on measuring and valuing and creating numbers. So what we must not forget, let me identify 5 things we must not forget. The local ecology, because every valuation has to be context specific and location specific. Secondly, the dynamics of the ecosystem have to be accounted for. No ecosystem is static, it changes over time. And as climate changes and as usage changes, it will change even more. So we need to account for ecosystem dynamics. Thirdly, we need to recognize that beyond a certain point, the services of the ecosystem that are being delivered might change dramatically because you've managed through your usage or through depleting the system to push it into another phase. In other words, you've tested the resilience of that ecosystem to such a point that it's crossed the threshold. And then bringing it back again is a hugely more complex exercise. Fourth, you've got to recognize that the monetary valuation that you are choosing depends on who you are. If you are the local community, you might have one yardstick. If you are a random visitor, another. If you are the government, yet a third. Let's take the university here. If you have a nice, beautiful courtyard with trees, and you're the president of the university who would like to preserve that view for good, you might take one estimate at valuation and one kind of discount rate. If you happen to be the local government who is just concerned about preserving that area as one of many public spaces which have got trees, you might take a second discount rate. And if you're just a passing random visitor who likes the view but may not come back again, you might take a third. So these are aspects of the complexity which do make a difference. And finally, and especially related to this idea of valuing by the locals and the agent, what about property rights? Depending on who you are, depending on what access rights you have, what usufruct rights you have, what property rights you have over the location, which provides the ecosystem service, you would value differently. One of the biggest ethical challenges of valuation, and indeed of monetization, is this whole question of discount rate. What discount rate should be used? Today's ecosystem service received today may be worth something, but if we are going to measure the value of the same service received in a year's time, maybe 5 years' time, maybe 10 years' time, maybe after a generation, that's a whole different game. How much is that future service worth today if we as a policymaker are making the decision to stop it, to destroy it, or to indeed invest in enhancing it? How do we decide that? That's what the discount rate does. It gives you the ratio of the value of the future, the same thing, versus the value today. Let's take an example. 10 Swiss francs. Today it's worth 10 Swiss francs, but if I were to put it into an envelope and say that, well, instead of giving it to you today to buy your lunch, I will give it to you in a year's time. Well, you won't be terribly happy because that's not very useful, but it's fair because I'm going to give you an interest rate for 1 year, which is 20 centimes. So now we have 10 francs and 20 centimes at 2% interest rate. But you might then argue, well, you know, the inconvenience of going and finding some place to buy because I'm ready to buy lunch downstairs. Okay, that's fine. loss of utility, I'll give you another 20 centimes, right? So here we have in this envelope a 10 franc note for your lunch in a year's time, sealed with 40 centimes. So there's a 4% extra sitting in there. The discount factor for this envelope, for it to be worth 10 francs today, would be 0.96. You are now happy to take this from me in a year's time as against taking 10 francs right now. So that what we've done is to show that the discount rate for cash is actually pretty close to an interest rate. But what if I took my lunch, which I have just purchased, some hot chocolate and a sandwich, and it was worth almost exactly 10 francs. And I said to you, well, you can have this now, and it's 10 francs, or let me just put it away for a year. There it is, nicely back in its bag. And the hot chocolate, which, sorry, won't be that hot in a year's time, and the sandwich, God forbid what it might be in a year's time. And I offer it to you 1 year forward. Are you comfortable with taking that for 10 francs with just the extra 40 centimes? I should think not. You wouldn't be able to eat this, and certainly you wouldn't like to drink that in a year's time. That was a goods discount rate. This was a cash discount rate. It's different. That's reality. And by the way, it's not just goods and cash that have different discount rates. What about public goods versus private goods generally? What about goods that are from nature versus goods that are made by man? All of these have logical reasons, like I just explained in one case, for having different discount rates over the same period of 1 year. The interest rate really only decides what is the discount rate for cash. Discounting might sound like a simple enough thing to do, but actually, as you can see, it is pretty complicated because there are different kinds of goods and services that can be discounted, which are in different types of ownership, and they come from different sources, whether they are factories on the one hand or nature from the other. Each of these probably deserves its own appropriate discount rate. Other questions also arrive. For instance, can discount rates be negative? Are discount rates an ethical choice, or is it just something that comes out of a screen on a computer if you click discount rate? These are all good questions to ask, and now let me try and answer them. One of the things we have to recognize is that certain discount rates may apply to personal goods, but there could be other discount rates which apply to society. Society's choice of receiving a benefit today versus a year's time versus 25 years' time. Those are social discount rates. The theory goes that if society made optimal investment decisions rationally, i.e. conditions of perfect foresight and other such assumptions, then the return on investment would be governed by what's known as Ramsey's rule. In other words, the rate of discount or the rate of return on investment would be the sum of two quantities. One is the rate of time preference. In other words, all other things being equal, how much more would I like something today versus in a year's time? And the second thing would be the wealth effect. The wealth effect needs a bit of explaining, because what it's saying is that in a society, as technology improves and as progress increases, there will be more goods and services produced in the future. Therefore, the marginal utility of the same good would be less. In other words, would a family be equally pleased with its third television set or its second car as it was with its second television set and its first car? Would it get the same utility from these third, fourth, fifth items of the same good or service? And the answer is probably not. So that's the wealth effect reason for discounting the future. So not everyone accepts all of these reasons. In fact, Ramsey himself found the time preference quite unsatisfactory, and he said it was a practice which is ethically indefensible and arises merely from the weakness of the imagination. Having said that, he still used it in his equation, and this is something that is still used quite consistently by economists when they measure and model discount rates. But let's take Ramsey's equation and see what would happen if, instead of measuring manufactured goods and services, we are now measuring nature's goods and services. Because unlike the factories of man, unlike the investment of man, which would probably produce more cars and more television sets in the future, we know that due to the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, there aren't going to be more ecosystem services being produced into the future. How then can we assume that there should be a positive discount rate using the wealth effect, when in fact we are going to be less wealthy in terms of natural goods and services, the free goods and services that come from nature, ecosystem services? So on that logic, you might argue that for the goods and services of nature, you ought to use a negative discount rate, reflecting the increased scarcity in the future, not the increased abundance in the future. Another dimension of discounting is the marginal utility of $1 or 10 Swiss franc to a normal person in a normal context versus someone who's extremely rich or someone who's extremely poor. They would have probably no marginal utility for 10 francs if they were too rich. If they were very poor, they would probably have high marginal utility for the same 10 francs because they could feed themselves for several days, not just one lunch. We need to take that into account when we apply discount rates across different socio-economic contexts, because the same dollar is not got the same utility or the same value for different societies, different communities at different stages of economic and social development. When it comes to intergenerational equity, it's interesting to see what typical research tends to suggest in terms of interest rates, and it's interesting to see what that means in ethical terms. The TEEP study in 2008 collected many valuation studies, and the typical discount rates that were being used there were between 3 and 5% in most cases. In other words, let's say an average of 4%, not dissimilar to the coin that I had to compensate you for the 10 francs that I gave. Now, that might appear to be a reasonable discount rate. However, if you think about intergenerational equity, in other words, taking a decision of trading off a piece of nature today with its ecosystem services outside the city or close to the national park or wherever, that decision will affect future generations. And if you apply the discount rate of 4% on a compounded basis for 25 years and then 50 years, let's say my grandchild, you get to a discount factor which is 0.14. In other words, what I'm saying, by stopping an ecosystem service today, which could be of value to my grandchild, when I trade that off using a discount rate of 4%, I'm ascribing to her 1/7 the value that I ascribe to myself. Excuse me, I have 2 daughters and I think they will have children. I don't think I dare do such a thing. I think it would be hopelessly unethical for me to suggest a discount rate of 4%, trading off the benefits that I enjoy versus the benefits, the same benefits that my granddaughters would be entitled to enjoy in 50 years' time. That's all about ethics. It's an ethical choice, that 4%. You could take the view that it shouldn't be 4%, it should be 0%, or you could indeed take the view, given scarcities and the wealth effect of Ramsey's equation, that it should be a negative rate and not a positive rate. In other words, as I hope I have been able to convince you, discounting might sound simple, but actually it's pretty complex and is quite rich in ethical content. We need to recognize that there are no purely economic answers. There is no button that you can press and get an answer out of a machine for a discount rate, and that it is an ethical choice. We need to recognize that there is a degree of responsibility towards future generations when it comes to intergenerational discounting, and a degree of responsibility towards other people on the planet when it comes towards lateral discounting, as in providing discount rates for poorer communities versus us. And finally, we need to recognize that there are a whole variety of discount rates that are possible. This can get extremely complicated when, for instance, you are making a policy decision between one course of action that generates private profit and another course of action over time, the same period, let's say 25 years, that generates public benefits. Because potentially you could be using 2 different discount rates for these 2 different courses of actions. And please, it's not the world of finance that tells you that you can't. I am from the world of finance. I've priced any number of cross-currency swaps. I've always used 2 different currency discount rates for pricing the 2 legs of that swap. So this is very much part of economic thinking, financial thinking, that we can and should be conscious of what we are discounting at the time that we apply discounts as a means of valuation.
Hello, in the next sequence I'm going to give you the introduction of the methods for environmental valuation. This is a part of environmental economics which started as a niche about 30 years ago, but now actually became mainstream. And in fact, all the major governments, all the major environmental NGOs, and all the major international organizations such as the World Bank, the UN, and the IUCN, they all use environmental valuation to make decisions. Before we embark into the description of all the different methods, let's ask ourselves the most fundamental question, which is, why do we value? Why do we need valuation? And the main reason why we need valuation is because any time we make a decision, we implicitly make a valuation. Ecosystems do provide us with lots of goods and services that we use and are very important for our existence on this planet. Therefore, when we think about valuation, we think about the methods that allow us to attach, quantify a value to this very long list of services and goods. Because this list is very long, we use the idea of a total value, more precisely a total economic value, as a composite of many different subsets. All these components may be represented in the following graph. In this graph, we can see the decomposition of the total economic value into different components. The first two main components are use values and non-use values. When we think about use values, we think about things which are very tangible or quite tangible to us. Think about direct consumption of services of the environment, things like the food we eat, the fiber we use in order to produce clothes, for instance. When instead we talk about indirect or non-extracted value, we're talking about the services that the ecosystem provides in order to make the planet the way it is. If you like, to regulate, for instance, the climate, to regulate the quality of air and the quality of water that then we experience as human beings living on the planet. The last important component of the direct use of the direct values is the option value. Option value is a very simple concept. In a sense, we value things not for their use that we make of them now, but for the use we think we can make of them in the future. Non-use value instead are usually classified in two different components. Bequest value, meaning that this is in a sense a measure of our altruism, how we value things not for our own consumption and our own use of them, but for the fact that the future generation will have indeed the possibility to use them in the future. While existing values are basically giving value something just because it does exist. Very simple. It doesn't have anything in a sense specifically that provides us with at the moment, but the mere existence of an ecosystem, of a species, or any environmental good, that idea has a value to us, and we benefit from that idea. In the graph, besides all the different components of the total economic value, you can also see already listed all the different methods, or some of the most important and most popular methods for valuation that are used indeed to capture those values and the benefits related to those values. We start with the first box, methods that we use to capture direct values. And in this case, more specifically, direct consumptive, extractive values. The first method is the travel cost method. I'm listing this method as a first because, first of all, it's the true granddaddy of all the methods for valuation. It started in the late 40s as an intuition from a very bright man called Harold Hotelling, who made lots of contribution to different fields of economics and statistics. His idea was very simple. We can guess those values just looking at people behavior. In other words, the easiest way to deduce the value people attach to things is just to observe their decisions and their behavior. The intuition of Hotelling was very simple. If we want to capture the value of a recreational site, like for instance a park, we can simply just aggregate the time and the money that the people use in order to go and visit those places. If we consider that there is a number of people that are willing to go and visit those places, and we aggregate those values, then we will have a figure which would be representative for society. So the idea was very simple, but at the same time very powerful, because it allows us to really start valuing things like a park or a recreational site. The applicability of the travel cost method is in fact pretty specific, because we actually use it indeed only for situations like recreational sites or endangered species that they do live in specific ecosystems. One of the issues that we face today is when we actually want to use the travel cost method is the fact that when hoteling had this intuition, traveling was taking a long time, it was a very expensive activity. Traveling in the last 50 years has become as an activity which has become more and more popular, less costly, and the time to go from A to B is gone down dramatically. So this is something we have to keep in mind when we want to use this type of analysis, and most of all if we want to use this type of analysis in the future. The next method that is in the box of the direct use is in fact the Hedonic method. Again, a very popular, very used, very powerful tool. The idea of the Hedonic pricing model is very similar in a sense to the travel cost method, because in a sense we get the values we are interested in observing existing market. So the idea is very simple again, the intuition is very simple again. Given that we don't have a market to value specifically clean air, or to value specifically, for instance, less noise pollution or a view, we use existing markets to proxy for those values. These markets are called, in fact, surrogate markets. They give us information indirectly about something we cannot measure directly. In these seminal papers is contained probably the first and most well-known application of these methods. In this paper, what these authors do is to capture the value of clean air in Boston by using the Zedonic pricing method. The idea is that in residential value, capture an amenity value like a park, but may capture also a very important variable like the amount of pollution that exists in that specific neighborhood. Imagine if you want to buy a flat or a house. Clearly, if you're going to buy this house in an area which is quiet and residential, the price probably will be very high, or probably will be higher than buying exactly the same property in an area in which instead you have lots of noise, lots of cars, and therefore lots of particulates and nitrogen to breathe. Now, the idea of the Hedonic pricing model is exactly that. Using these prices, we can see how these specific attributes, having less noise or having better air to breathe, is in fact reflected in the final price that people are willing to pay. And if this is the price that people are willing to pay, this is the price that indeed, by people we mean society, is willing to attach to these specific attributes that are environmental. The next method is production function. This is the method that I like to say that is probably the most interdisciplinary of them all. Because we need two components. We need an economic component, of course, but also we need to be backed up by the knowledge that scientists provide us with. In this method, what we do is just to see how a change, for instance, in ecosystem assets is then translated in a change in the productivity or in the income or in other measure of interest to us. The classic example is, for instance, what happens if we have a reduction in the number of species in an ecosystem. In other words, what is biodiversity worth? Agroecologists tell us that the number of species plays a very important role in determining plant biomass. In other words, there is a very important relationship between the number of species we have in a system and the productivity of this very system. Now, if the productivity of the very system is in fact expressed in a unit or in a type of crops that has a market value, then we can do valuation, because we can measure how much the change, for instance, in the number of species will be translated in the change in the productivity of the system itself. In this paper by Tillman and his associate, for instance, you can see how the relationship between the number of species and the productivity of the system is actually estimated. Now, we, environmental economists, may take this intuition, may take this idea, and estimate the very same function in different systems. Systems probably are not under the control of the experimenters, but they are the systems that exist out there. So in the next paper by Di Falco and Chavas, for instance, we estimated the value of the number of species in an agricultural system. More specifically, we asked ourselves how much having spatial diversity in a system is corresponding to increasing levels of productivity. This is an extremely important question because, especially for systems like agriculture, we experience more and more levels of monocultures. So if we lose a species and we turn from an agriculture which is more diverse to an agriculture which is more characterized by monoculture, we may lose not only species but also the productivity which is attached to it. In this paper we take data for more than 20 years from the south of Italy, and we may estimate the same relationship that Tillman has estimated with his co-authors in his paper in 2005. And we find that the value of having more species is indeed very large. And this value is large both in the short run and in the long run. An increase in 10% of spatial diversity is associated with an increase in 8% in productivity. And the very same increase will deliver an increase in productivity in the longer run, which will be close of 30%. So these are very large benefits that nature provides and that we can estimate using the production function method. Before we move into the methods we use to evaluate non-use values, let's have a very quick critical assessment of these methods. I try to persuade you that these methods we discussed, they are very powerful and very useful. On the other hand, they're not problem-free. And before anyone embarks in evaluation exercise, it's very important that appreciates what the possible shortcomings of these methods are. Specifically, when we think about the hedonic price model, the very important thing to keep in mind is that we are using a surrogate market to capture an environmental value. So there is a market that indirectly provides us information about an environmental assets. Now, if this very market is not very well functioning or is imperfect or absent, then the data we obtain out of it are not good data to use in valuation. In other words, we are in a situation in which we have biased estimates of the analysis. When on top of that we consider the production function approach, the production function approach, besides the problem with the data in itself, also has an extra problem, or an extra, if you like, condition that needs to be met. And this condition is that we need to know what the relationship between environmental assets and the outcome we are interested in is to begin with. In the example I provided on the relationship between biodiversity in agriculture and productivity in agroecosystem, there we started from a very important strand of literature in agroecology that will tell us what the causal relationship between these two things is. And then we estimated that relationship using different data. Now, if we don't have that kind of knowledge, then it will be very difficult to apply any model. The next method in the list is contingent valuation. Contingent valuation is very useful and very powerful because it can be applicable when other things cannot be applicable. For instance, when we want to elicit things like existence value or bequest value. What contingent valuation does is a very simple thing. It creates an hypothetical market. Creates, in fact, a market that does not exist. It has been applied to parks and fisheries and endangered species, and more recently has been also being used to value things like the quality of water, if you like. Again, it's a method which relies a lot on doing surveys. You go around, you ask people how much they will be willing to pay, for instance, for preserving an environment where these species or these other species exist. So in a survey, we ask individuals to evaluate hypothetically a species or an environment or an ecosystem by eliciting directly what their willingness to pay to preserve that specific environmental assets or good. Now imagine you're going to ask many people basically the same question: how much are you willing to pay to preserve this environment where a panda will survive? How much are you willing to pay to conserve the habitat in order to have this type of species surviving, for instance? You can ask that questions in a single shot. You can ask that questions in different iterative fashion, but the sense and the idea underlying contingent valuation is exactly the same, eliciting directly by asking people on a situation which is purely hypothetical. The fact that this method is hypothetical allows us to go where we cannot go otherwise. On the other hand, the fact indeed is hypothetical is also the main potential problem with the use of this methodology. For instance, when we are in a hypothetical environment, are individuals really telling us what they really want, what the real benefits of that is? Is the number they're going to tell you, is that $100, 50 francs, 20 euros, going to be a true measure of their benefits? So if the answer is yes to the question, then we are in business. If the answer is no, unfortunately, then the entire exercise of valuation is flawed. This is called the hypothetical bias. And this is one of the main things we have to be very aware when we do valuation using contingent valuation. A second very important bias we may incur when we use a contingent valuation is what is called the information bias. What people do know. In a sense, we're asking them things about something which is completely hypothetical. In a way, one way to get around this problem is to create a survey in which there is a very important section in which all the information to the respondent are provided. But of course, when you randomly stop people on the street, you don't really know what's in their head. You don't really know what kind of knowledge they have, what their priors, if they are some activist, for instance, belonging to some NGO, environmental NGO, and so forth. So one of the key problems with that is to make sure that through a carefully worded questionnaire and a section in which base information are homogeneously provided to individuals, we can at least assume that the base of decision and the base of the answer is indeed the same. Another important source of bias is in fact what is called the strategic bias. When we are in a setup in which there is an interviewer and a respondent, some things can happen. People may change their attitude, they may start giving answer not because they really believe in them, but they want to attach, there is some strategic behavior in that answer. I may want, for instance, to answer to you in a way because I think I want to please you, I want to please the interviewers, or I want to give an image of myself which is not necessarily the truth. This is another thing that we need to keep in mind when we do contingent valuation. There are many other biases in contingent valuation potentially, but for the time being I stop there and I let you read what's in the material. Valuation methods are a great tool to attach value to ecosystem services. However, these methods are all subject to a larger set of assumptions and therefore must be really handled with care. These are very powerful tools that we can use, but we can also unfortunately misuse. I hope I persuaded you that the possibilities are there, but at the same time a very critical approach when we choose this method is always required.
Hi, I'm going to talk a bit today about what I think is wrong with ecosystem services approaches from basically a philosophical perspective, although I'll also bring in some ideas from politics, anthropology and sociology. Now this is a big subject, and I can't say very much in this short time, but you'll see that some slides have links on them so you can follow up what I'm saying. I'm going to be encouraging you to engage in some critical reflection on things that seem to be just taken for granted when we talk about the world in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services. So here's the first one. The world is not really made of capital. Just as people are not really human capital, the natural world in all its dazzling variety is not really made of natural capital. Economies exist inside ecosystems, not the other way around. Capital is a very particular concept that makes sense only in a particular set of social relations. It's something that can be traded, something liquid, something that is of value essentially not for what it is, but for what it can buy. We can see this very clearly in ideas of offsetting, whether of carbon or of biodiversity. Trading is at the centre of the whole approach. And here I mean both trading between different forms of natural capital and also trading between natural capital and so-called human capital, financial capital or social capital. Ideas of natural capital and ecosystem services lay great stress on commensurability and equivalence. This is hardly surprising since the whole idea was created in order to allow environmental issues to be addressed using the tools of economics and finance. But as the psychologist Abraham Maslow has pointed out, if the only thing you've got is a hammer, you tend to treat everything as if it was a nail. This is a bit of a problem, because not only because some things are hard or impossible to price, but also because pricing things can actually endanger them. Exposure to markets may not be a responsible way to treat your natural capital. And you can see this illustrated in many places, but particularly with the collapsing price of carbon in the European Union emissions trading system. Everybody thought the price was going to go up. In fact, it went right down. We just don't know in any given case what the effects of market exposure are going to be. Another point is that you cannot actually pay nature to do things. Any of these payments that we're talking about are only going to be going to people. And if you're appealing to the profit motive, people are going to do what's profitable. And this may not be what you expect or what you wanted them to do. If economics has taught us anything, it's that people are very good at gaming the system. So there are ecological concerns that natural capital accounting can never actually capture the complexity and unpredictability of natural systems. There are also ethical concerns about not recognising the values that people actually do have. And there's a link here to a paper in the journal Ecosystem Services exploring some value struggles around biodiversity offsetting in the UK. Most cultures, historically and even today, don't actually value the natural world in ways which translate easily into the idea that nature provides services for people. This problematic idea of cultural ecosystem services is what's supposed to bridge this gap, but it never will. As the ecosystem services approach becomes dominant in education and in policy, there's a big danger of erasing other ways of looking at the world and relating to nature. Of course, a great deal of this has happened already over centuries of European colonialism. Rather than continuing this process, surely it would be better to actually listen to what those other cultures think and have to say about how to live with the non-human world. There's another link here to some work by an anthropologist who makes this point. Another problem is how to best communicate environmental messages, whether to the public, to businesses or to policymakers. Now, psychology tells us that in fact communicating these in financial terms is not a very effective way of influencing people's behaviour. If you're trying to get across an environmental point, you have to appeal to people's environmental values that they actually hold, not indirectly appeal to an economic framing. And there's a link here to work by a psychologist on this. the upshot is that it's a very bad idea to be talking about the environment in ways that reinforce attitudes of financial self-interestedness and competitiveness, given that it's precisely these attitudes that have got us in the mess we're in. So it really does matter how we talk about things. We measure the things our models tell us to measure, and we value the things our models tell us to value. For instance, people all over the world are now measuring trees to see how much carbon is in them. Now, carbon sequestration in forests is of course very important, but there's lots of other important things about trees, and forests are now being bought and sold in quite a large scale by people basically as investments in carbon, and for some of those people at least it seems likely that it's only the carbon that they're actually valuing. What are the implications of that? We just don't know yet. And there's a link here to some work in sociology about how economic theories actually create the markets and social relations that they claim to be describing. There's many worries here about what we might be creating in this new world of financial investment and economic policy based on ecosystem services. One being that there could arise a carbon bubble, rather like the subprime mortgage bubble of 2008. Natural capital and ecosystem services are always presented as both optimistic and pragmatic ways of approaching environmental policy making. People who question the market approaches are disparaged as utopian, as naive, as doomsayers. Sometimes, as recently by Dieter Helm, they're described as dangerous anti-capitalist fundamentalists with totalitarian leanings. But perhaps it's the idea that finance and markets can save the planet that is utopian or naive. Perhaps it's the idea that there is no alternative to market-based approaches that is fundamentalist. It's certainly pessimistic. Why give up on the idea that different forms of social and economic organisation might be possible? So, in conclusion, I'd just say that when conservation and environmental objectives conflict with so-called free markets, and indeed with capitalism itself, we should say so. As Einstein's supposed to have said, you can't solve a problem using the same thinking that created it.
It is raining. It was not expected, but here in the tropical mountains of Colombia, we cannot tell when it's going to rain. Rain is a common feature behind biodiversity, and the seasons of rain have been known by people a long time ago. Seasons of rain demark the patterns of all animals for spawning, for feeding, for reproducing, for migrating. Here we don't have seasons in the sense that European countries or temperate countries have, but behind the rainy season and the dry season, everything happens. Agriculture, the events of the communities, the production calendars, and everything that moves behind the organic life of the world. Many local communities, many indigenous groups that still live in the Colombian mountains, as well as in the Mexican deserts or in the Argentinian pampas, behave and coordinate their activities to the rain, to the pass of the humid season to the dry season, and they go out and hunt, fish, grow food, harvest wood, or whatever activities they need to do accordingly. We are always tempted to blame rain or to blame whatever issues happen in the field for not being able to hunt a big prey, for not being able to produce enough food. And then we start talking to the rain and say, hey, I'm going to get some food for my kids, I'm going to try to plant some seeds, so please help me. And then you, while doing your activities, start to give agency to the rain. And then you start to give agency to the plants that grow thanks to the rain or to the nutrients on the soil. And then you start talking to the pollinators. and start talking to the predators and the worms that pest the food, and start making deals with them. So the first feature I want to highlight when talking about cultural values linked to biodiversity is the way we start talking to nature and how we give agency to the other living beings of the earth. People such as the Kogi in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in the northern part of Colombia live in a huge mountain very close to the sea. They have a calendar of migration that comes every year with movements of the community from the sea level to the high peaks at 12,000 feet. During these movements, they grow maize or corn, they fish, they hunt, they use the products of the forest, and they create a narrative of their biodiversity, and they allocate time and allocate responsibilities through the people for doing whatever need they have. This migration, vertical migration it's called, is based on a learning process that has come through millennials, so centuries, where everybody tries to help create well-being for the community. Everybody tries to define a specific role in collaboration with the elders, in collaboration with the kids, and then the social frame of the community is also linked to the land, is linked to the processes that lay behind biodiversity. Therefore, language, livelihoods, and explanations that keep everything together, everything in kind of in a basket thread, is the way each community is adapted, each culture is adapted to its regional conditions, ecological conditions. That's why we talk about socio-ecological approaches to understand biodiversity management. And each community has its own ways to relate to biodiversity, to relate to nature, and even to name nature and biodiversity. Each community has its own view of the plants, animals, and processes that bring energy, food, fiber to their own way of living. We know that biodiversity is a local feature. Animals, plants, microbes, and their communities they are part of are strongly related to the soil conditions, to the climate, to the latitude and the longitude of the continents, and therefore humans have to approach biodiversity on that scale. Humans have to understand biodiversity at the local level because that's where they can interact. Of course, you can watch TV shows about the polar bears, and here from Colombia we have a slight idea on how are the forests in Europe or in Russia. But for our daily lives, what matters is the conditions of the weather here, the conditions of the plants here, and the conditions of the animals here and now. And that's why we depend strongly on the feedback we receive from our activities on the landscape, on the ecosystem, or in nature. And we talk to nature, we try to understand how nature behaves and how our behavior affects nature. But that has a strong flavor grounded on local conditions. And therefore, those conditions change through time because there's lots of learnings, lots of lessons learned from our interaction to that biodiversity. Those lessons are translated into duties, rights, capacities, and at the end on institutions. Then you can feel how is the chain from the contact from everybody with nature to the livelihoods, to the language, and then to the social institutions. How we can translate even a slight contact with a butterfly to a Ministry of Environment in case of Western culture, or towards a community institutional association of agricultural people, or towards a guild of fishing persons. Rules, rights, they really express the full amount of the value that a local perspective on biodiversity is able to contribute to the management of the land. To keep the knowledge about nature, to keep the practices that allow us to get food, to get resources for our daily lives, require an educational strategy, a way of talking to the young people about the life, to invite them to share experiences with biodiversity. In each culture, this process is completely different because of the unique experience that everybody has related to nature, related to animals and plants. There's many different ways to synthesize the particular narratives that express that relation. And if I talk to the rain, if I talk to the trees, and I give agency to the fishes and to the animals, then I share this vision with my kids. I comment what were this talk, what we were talking about with nature, with those plants and animals, and we create a bigger dialogue with nature, which takes many different phases. Strategies for transmitting that are very particular, and they embed the values we hold about biodiversity. We have songs, we have celebrations, carnivals, we have specific times on the calendar to mourn, to enjoy the harvest, to go out to the field and use any particular resource that is available at that part of the time. Then those languages really represent and has a cue for understanding the values that the culture have towards biodiversity. By example, in the Amazon, decisions about hunting or about fishing or about agriculture are taken at night. Everybody, and especially the elders, meet on the dark, and they chew the leaf of coca in many different ways, and they share their dreams, and they talk about the happenings of the day. Well, I had a conversation with a big fish, and he escaped from me. I encountered some plant that was weird, or just the daily life we are able to share. And then this creates a frame, an ecological context for people to see what is going to happen tomorrow, what is going to happen next week. It embeds lots of synecology, which means relations, understanding and being aware of the relations of people and nature. And then this is a full strategy for managing biodiversity, which is completely different than us in Western science. We have satellites, we have monitoring devices, we have our science. But in the field, when you go to other communities with other histories and different approaches to nature, you also have those ways and means to keep track of the changes, daily changes, monthly changes, yearly changes on nature, without the need of very complex instruments. Then we have all the dimensions of the Western culture as well in any other cultures. And we have to respect and to understand that ours is just one way to relate to nature. And in fact, our way stresses the distance from nature and us. In many local communities and in many indigenous cultures, nature is just one part of the society. Animals are part of our communities, and we have strong ties and even kinship with the rest of the living part of the world. The departure point for a system of knowledge, as we were discussing before, is the way our minds frame an image of nature. And minds are exposed to different kinds of phenomena in nature. We grow in the middle of seasons, in the middle of flocks of birds, in the middle of noisy crickets or birds that are singing around myself. But in many cases, the way our mind frames nature is completely different than ours in the Western culture. Greeks created a way of seeing the world, of understanding the world. But there are hundreds of different ways of creating and building an image of the world into our brains. One of the most striking examples I know is that of the Ayahuasca or Yahe cultures. The Ayahuasca culture is mostly found in the Amazon, and many different groups share that way of knowing and framing an image of the world. And the most interesting issue of the Ayahuasca cultures is that people at the age of 9 or 10 start to drink the result of a mixture of plants, one of them being the vine of ayahuasca mixed with other plants, and through that they start to dream while being awake. And that dream, it's a real neurological change of the brain functions. And through that type of dream, they are able to talk to nature, to talk to plants, and even to become a plant or to become an animal. In the shamanistic cultures, you can become a wolf in the Russian steppes, you can become a coyote in the United States Great Plains, or you can become a jaguar in the rainforest. And that's not an invention. It's something that your brain, under the training and under the views that you get through the ayahuasca, creates. Therefore, the image of the world, the image of the ecosystem is quite different. The experience that you have in the middle of kind of, you can say, virtual reality that is created by the use of ayahuasca is completely different than the Western view. When you have a conversation with people that lives in the rainforest and they talk to you about very specific conversations they had with certain beings that they encountered through their lives, such as the jaguar person, such as the anaconda or snake person, you just get you just smile and say, okay, that's imagination, that's a way of thinking. But in fact, there's a full set of categories that are behind that way of thinking. You just don't think that plants are the same than for Linnaeus or in the Western taxonomical system. Therefore, botany, zoology, soil science, and even ecology uses quite different categories for describing the world than most of the local communities. And we have to accept that some of those categories cannot be translated. You just have to accept that the world means differently to different communities or to different people. And as you grow old, you understand that those visions of the world are equally valid, equally important, and in fact, they enrich the daily lives of everybody. That those views are a demonstration that the mental abilities, intellectual abilities of humanity are quite diverse, and we need not just to enjoy them, acknowledge them, but make them some room in our dominating institutions. We need those visions of divergence of the world, and we need the visions of the local people about their local environments, even if the categories that they use to describe or manage those issues are really, really different than ours. Local communities that depend, by example, on fishing. There's plenty of societies in our continent in America that really need a fish on the plate for every day's meal, and they got it. And from very different species. We have 400 species of fish in the Colombian Amazon or in the Magdalena River. And people know the behavior of the fishes, they know the ecology, the natural history, and because they rely on that knowledge for surviving. But as I mentioned before, they also have ways of talking to the fish, they have ways of naming those fishes, they have allocated rights and properties for that fish. Therefore, the meaning of well-being, of the needs that lie behind our existence may vary quite much. People may be satisfied with just one fish and let the rest go away, even if they can get them and to take them to the market and make money. Values and knowledge are quite related in that situation. People knows or believes that they don't have the right, they would misbehave, or they just will damage their own futures if they take more than they need. But that's also a fact of each culture. It's socially and culturally defined. And there's why there are many conflicts between cultural views about nature and about biodiversity. Who has the right to name something as a resource? Who can stand defending some type of animal or plant because of their preferences or his or she's preferences? And therefore, we are in the middle of a cultural struggle that has many ways of being solved, but the first and most important dimension has to do with respect, appreciation, and mutual understanding. I think that the approach that the IPBES, by example, is following, or the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is going to that way, to really invite all knowledge systems that lie behind specific portions of the land and specific societies to be expressed freely, to be developed, and to be included into the decisions of the governments and the institutions for protecting and managing sustainability in the world. Finally, I want to mention that knowledge systems are never static. Even the most traditional indigenous have knowledge systems that evolve, that adapt, that are able to incorporate new languages, new knowledge, new values. And therefore, there's a double dimension on the existence of knowledge systems. The knowledge that the people has, the community shares, and of course the politics that emerge from that knowledge. People has the right to position their values and their ways of seeing and understanding nature in the middle of other communities and in the middle of social struggles or territorial struggles. That's the history of Earth. But they also have the right to contribute through that view to the process of innovating ways of adapting to the world changes. And particularly in these times when climate change is really affecting everybody, is affecting all the lands and all the societies, indigenous and local knowledge systems are thinking about the challenges and the way their own views of the biodiversity and the natural phenomena can be handled to adapt to such situations. So the political and scientific linkages are alive in every community, and we cannot pretend that local communities, indigenous communities, don't express that those beliefs and those values, and that they are not incorporated into a wider political discussion. And there is where science sometimes fails, thinking that everything is objective and that we can handle the changes of the world just with knowledge and not with some advocacy.
My name is Salman Hussain. I'm the team coordinator based in UNEP in Geneva. And today I want to present a case study around marine ecosystem services. It's very important to look at marine ecosystems because they provide a great deal of benefit to humanity in terms of the provision of ecosystem services overall. And further, a study by Halpern et al. Science presented the idea that not only do we have a great deal of provisioning, but that provisioning is under threat. What that means is that multiple drivers are affecting the benefits that we might generate from marine ecosystems, and often these benefits are invisible. A response to this was that the UK government tried to initiate an exercise in the development of a network of marine protected areas. Now, marine protected areas in UK parlance are called marine conservation zones, and the idea of assessing and then developing and then putting into place marine protected areas was to look at the benefits that would be lost if we were to have business as usual, compared to the benefits that would actually be gained from implementing marine conservation zones. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. Whenever we're carrying out a valuation exercise, we have to be sure to understand in biophysical terms what exactly the changes we're looking at. And so the study that was commissioned by DEFRA, the UK government, wherein SAC in Edinburgh and the University of Liverpool doing the biophysical work together, that study was based on a network of marine protected areas, 3 different ones that you'll see in the slide, which had different specific conditions applied in terms of the generation of those networks. And for each of these networks, the DEFRA, the UK government, wanted to look at 2 different levels of restrictions. So again, to be clear, we want to know the counterfactual, what would happen without the marine protected areas and what would happen with the marine protected areas. The scenarios are fairly unromantically called A, G and J, which are listed in the slide that you see. And what you see in the next slide after that is the UK continental shelf. The slide of the UK continental shelf shows us the potential designation of a network of marine protected areas. But we have to go beyond that single network to look at what the benefits might be from different network options overall. Within the networks that are being assessed, there are also 2 different levels of restriction which are also to be assessed. So 3 different network scenarios and 2 different levels of restriction. As you'd imagine, the highly restricted network provision basically one where almost all actions and activities of an industrial nature would be prohibited within that marine protected area. The next slide shows where the economics cuts in. I mentioned already in scenario analysis we have to look at what happens relative to the counterfactual of business as usual. What happens if we actually apply a network of marine protected areas? What happens to provision of ecosystem services? So we have 4 rays for the sake of simplicity coming from the origin here, which show how sometimes ecosystem service provisioning will increase, sometimes it will stay stable, and sometimes it will decrease. So always looking at the change between what would happen under business as usual versus what would happen if we actually applied the marine protected area under the restrictions that are being specified. The next slide gives us a categorization of the types of services that marine ecosystems provide. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the slide after that gives us the starting point with which the consortium working on this work had to try to generate valuation benefits. Typically in valuation, we have the polar opposite problem to the one we had in this particular study. i.e. you may have a single value estimate for a single particular site, and then from that we have to somehow generalize to see what the benefits would be for a much wider area. We have the reverse here. We had a series of estimates of individual values for ecosystem services across the entire UK waters, and we somehow had to try to work out what the benefits of the marine conservation would be given these total aggregate estimates that you see in this slide. So there are 3 methodological steps we had to apply given these totals. We have a bit of a kind of what we might call a cookie cutter approach. We had to say for each of these networks, A, G and J, how much of a particular type of marine landscape or habitat is being protected. We also had to ask ourselves how important is that marine landscape in terms of provisioning of that service, and how much would the reduction therefore be in the value of ecosystem service provisioning if we were to continue under business as usual as compared to applying that protection. The next slide shows you the UK seabed landscape. After that, as I said, the slightly bizarre way of putting it, but the cookie cutter approach is to say, well, let's look at one of those types of habitats or landscapes, a photic reef. So the next slide shows us where exactly a photic reef, by way of example, are located within the UK seabed map. Only a subset of a photic reef will actually be part of any one network that's going to be protected, and that is shown in the 3rd slide. The next slides pull this all together by showing us the different landscapes under network scenario A, and equivalent maps exist for network scenario J and G. We then in the valuation team had to ask our partners who were doing the biophysical assessment to give us some indication of how we would look at particular ecosystem service and determine the importance of a particular type of marine landscape or habitat in terms of provisioning that service. So we had various responses. In terms of some services, we could look at the value based on the sheer area. Other services, the provisioning we depended upon how close it is to shoreline, for instance. So there's a range of different options we had to look at to allow for the biophysical variability in terms of landscapes and ecosystem services. So once we know how important, say for instance, a photic reef is relative to other landscapes, the next question is how big an impact will the conservation of that particular aphotic reef have? And so the next slide looks at these different ranges that we have. Will it have a very large change? Would it be a 90% change? Or would it be a very small change overall? Economists always focus on what we call marginal change. We always have to look at the change relative to what would happen without the policy off scenario. So that marginal change might be 90%, might be 10%, but we've also got to look at the trajectory of that change, by which I mean how quickly will that change happen, and what will be the kind of change? Will it be a linear trajectory? Will it be exponential, etc.? Because ultimately we need to know when the change occurs, because in economic terms, if you're doing an impact assessment and you're applying discounting, you have to be aware of when change occurs and how it will occur. Turning to the overall results, using this valuation and applying a 3.5% discount rate, we found that the value of the benefits range between approximately 10 and 22 billion pounds. This is an extremely large number. Even in applying the sensitivity analysis, which means if we try to take the lower bound estimates for our values, that is reduced by around about 30%. What's interesting in our analysis is to look at how that actually compares with the estimates which are independently calculated and assessed in terms of costs. The present value of the cost estimates was between 0.4 and around 1 billion. So what you can see from this assessment is the ratio of benefits to costs is at least 7 to 1, i.e. for every pound you spend, you get a return of something like £7 in terms of benefits were you to actually apply a network of marine protected areas. Even this is an underestimate. Why? Because we are only looking at the value estimate for 7 of the 11 ecosystem services. It's extremely likely that for those other ecosystem services for which we had no valuation data point to look at, those would also be positively benefited by having marine conservation. So there's an underestimate for that reason. The second reason there's an underestimate is because there is a network effect. If we're simply assuming that 1 hectare of photic reef, wherever it is, will generate some benefit, that is a simplification. If we constructively, and by physical terms, generate a network of marine protected areas, the benefits from the network are greater than the individual hectares that are actually protected. It's important to understand in the valuation that we're never going to have any precision in our estimation. This is why we carry out sensitivity analysis. But it's also important to recognize that in the absence of valuation, sometimes decisions that we'd want to make that lead to conservation do not happen. The reason why this case study in particular I think is quite an important one is because this was part of the evidence base used by the UK government to actually enact the UK Marine Act. There's extreme hesitancy and indeed a strong lobbying against conservation of marine protected areas. There are important industries such as telecommunications, fisheries, etc., who had an important voice, and that voice was recognised. But the argument made in economic terms is a very strong one, which said that the benefits are extremely large. And this is why this kind of work and implying valuation, I think, is important in terms of changing policies so we can have a more sustainable planet. Thank you very much.
In the next sequence, I'm going to introduce an application of valuation methods on a very important problem. And the problem is, how do we measure the impact of climate change in agriculture? According to the IPCC 2013 and also 2007, the agricultural sector is the most exposed to the impact of climate change. And this is obvious because agriculture is one of the economic sectors who's actually more exposed to the vagaries of climate, but is also more exposed to the changes in things like temperature and rainfall. These two variables clearly dictates the capacity we have to produce agricultural commodities. So the questions I'm going to address in this sequence is how do we measure those costs? How do we calculate those impacts? The first and most important probably way to think about this problem is to go back to the idea of the production function, where on the left-hand side of the equation you have a measure of biomass, you have a measure of quantity or productivity of an agricultural commodities, let's say wheat, let's say rice, let's say corn, and on the right-hand side of your equation you instead have an environmental variable, but this time your environmental variable is a climatic variable, is temperature, is rainfall. And then as you will do in a production function approach, you would estimate this relationship, have a parameter that will tell you how much a change in the temperature will be reflected into a change into the production of that agricultural commodities, and then use the value to calculate how much a warmer world or a drier world will be affecting agriculture. Now, there is a fundamental problem with this idea. And the fundamental problem is that when we use this parameter then to estimate the cost or the impact of climate change on agriculture, we are assuming that nothing changes. Nothing changes in the technology, nothing changes in conditions and society, but most important, people who are in fact the receiver of the environmental impact, in this case the climatic change, they do nothing about it. This is what is called the dumb farmer scenario. We are thinking like people experience a world in which temperature goes up, rainfall goes down, and they do nothing about it. And this is, of course, a very realistic assumption because, as a matter of fact, one of the key things individuals do when they face difficulties is adapting. And adaptation means doing things which require changes. This is what, at the end of the day, an adaptive responsive is. If we use the production function approach, what will happen is that we are not going to consider in our measurement the adaptive response of an individual. So we need a framework which allows us to do so. So a possibility is to use what is called the Ricardian Approach, a method popularized by Robert Mendelssohn in 1994, Mendelssohn from Yale. He basically suggested to use, instead of a measure of a biomass, of a measure of production, of a quantity of a given product, use land values. Why land values will give us the opportunity to capture the impact of climate change better than, let's say, kilograms of wheat or tons of wheat per hectare? Because land values, they will allow you to consider all the substitution possibility that an individual or a farmer may have. Imagine if you want to buy a piece of land. If this piece of land, for instance, will be provided with very good quality land and very good climate and so forth, what will happen? That you will be able to do many things with it. In other words, as you can see in this graph, people may, for instance, be able to shift from the production of wheat to the production of corn. And then if the temperature continue to raise, they can shift into a different type of activity like grazing. And then if we end up in a very warm world, so hot that there is no possibility to do any agriculture, then land value will capture indeed the possibility you have in using your land at that point in time, which is probably just doing residential home, where all the old people in the world can come and, in a sense, enjoy warm weather. Now, using the land values allow, indeed, this possibility of capture all the substitutions that we have. As a result, if we use a Ricardian model instead of using a standard production function, what we will have is that most of the time the estimated cost of climate change would be smaller. But that doesn't mean that the costs of climate change are negligible. It's just having a method that allows us to have the most precise measurement. Now, it's important to stress that also the Ricardian model, even though provides us with a better response and a better capacity to measure those impacts than the production function, has a very important key assumption. And the very important key assumption is that the markets are functioning perfectly. Now, this key assumption of having perfectly functioning market, and not a minor one, is a major one. Because, as we already discussed in the sequence on evaluation of ecosystem services, one very important element of this class of models is to be able to have a functioning market to provide us with valuable data. If the market doesn't function perfectly, and there are some frictions in the adjustment of demand and supply, for instance, for land, then the price we are getting out of this scheme is not a price that is correct. And if this price of land is not correct, then our valuation methods will provide us with flawed results. So, in conclusion, the Ricardian model is a massive step ahead, but the working conditions may be pretty restrictive. And I'm thinking about, for instance, large part of the world where markets for land do not function perfectly. Think about sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. Many parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa are plagued by weak property rights, are plagued by unenforced property rights, and therefore the markets for land don't function properly. So if we collect data on the value of land in those parts of sub-Saharan Africa where the markets don't function properly, those data are flawed. And this is my last consideration, the key problem with that is most of the impact of climate change in agriculture will actually happen around the tropic. It will actually happen around sub-Saharan Africa. So, unfortunately, the best method we have is not very much applicable at the moment to the areas of the world where the impact of climate change would be felt the most.
There are two pieces I see to the argument that we can't put a value on nature, or we shouldn't put a value on nature. And the first is not a problem, and the second is potentially a problem. So the first one that's not a problem is people who don't understand the underlying economics of natural resources. Most ecosystem services are both non-excludable and non-rival, which means that if I own 100 hectares of forests, and I sell carbon credits to it, I can't put up a wall and keep my neighbors from using the benefits of carbon sequestration and, say, clean water and clean air that are provided by my forest. That's a way that many ecosystem services are non-rival and non-excludable. We can't put up fences and keep our neighbors from using those public benefits. So there are people that are concerned that think that if we put a dollar value on nature and put them into markets, that it'll suddenly mean that nature gets sold off and we can't use them. Well, that's really not true when we look at the nature of natural resources. So a little bit of economics understanding goes away to help diffuse that. The second issue, which I think is a bit more of a real issue, is the concern that putting a dollar value on something undermines the intrinsic value and importance of conserving nature. And I personally believe there is a strong intrinsic value of conserving nature. There's been a lot of work about social norms and whether having a price tag on something demeans it in terms of, and this has been applied to a number of public health and public policy questions. Should you be able to buy the right to jump ahead in a line, or to get faster or better medical care, or to emigrate to a country if you're looking to do so? And does putting a dollar value on those things undermine the sort of inherent rights that people should have? That's a philosophical question, but I think it's an important one. I think that's balanced out at the same time by, of course, the argument that many of us in our field are making, that putting a dollar value on nature lets us compare and bring these values into decision making. At the same time, it's not a cure-all. Just putting a dollar value on nature doesn't mean conservation is always going to win, and conservationists need to understand that. There are cases where ecosystem service values can decline. There are cases where the opportunity cost of conserving nature, the value of extractive resource use, real estate development, et cetera, is going to be so high that that even when we make a good economic argument for conservation, it's not going to carry the day. And I think those situations are what that second group of people are concerned about, that we need to, at the same time as we're developing methods to map and value nature, we also need to be hopefully fostering a broader dialogue about the intrinsic value of nature and why that matters too.
It seems almost profane to be equating these most fundamental of benefits that the world provides us to dollars. It just seems like you're making them grubby doing this. But what you've got to remember is that valuation is absolutely unavoidable. Every time you make a decision, you are saying that thing I'm going to do is more important, more valuable than this other thing that I'm not going to do. So every decision has a value in it. It just depends whether you want to be explicit about that, the fact that you have made a choice, you've decided to plant a forest rather than build another hospital, or just pretend that didn't happen and just allow the valuation to come out implicitly. You can't avoid the fact that there always is a valuation every time you make a decision. Should you leave it implicit? never really investigate it? Maybe it was a good trade-off, maybe it wasn't. Or should you actually try and make it explicit? I think the latter, because I think we're not spending enough on the natural environment and in securing the benefits that it provides into the future, because we're not making the values explicit.
So I think most of the people would agree that it's useful to put a value on nature. The problem is putting a dollar value. Would you imagine other ways of putting a value on nature than through a monetary way?
No. The fact is that I go back to my experience in government. So I'm from the UK. There is a committee in the Treasury that ultimately makes the decision: how much are we going to spend on the health service? How much are we going to spend on transport? If you suddenly decide that, okay, we've worked out health benefits and we've turned those into money. We've worked out transport benefits, we've turned those into money, and so on. And then suddenly there's this other category, the environment. And instead of using the same unit all the way, suddenly this is expressed in numbers of birds and tons of carbon and milligrams of nitrate. It's impossible to make that simple trade-off without trying to make them commensurate. And so what you end up with is the environment being undervalued where it really, really matters. In the centre of government, where those decisions have to be made, and they're made using systems which, well, I actually think they're perfectly defensible systems, because they try to make all these different things that we want commensurate with each other. They try and say, we know society wants schools, we know it needs roads, we know it wants a health service, it wants a policing service, all these sort of things. We have an idea that it wants a healthy environment as well, but we just don't know how to understand the benefits that are provided by that. So I think there's no alternative. I've heard of people trying to turn these things into kilocalories and do the whole lot on energetics and that sort of stuff. That seems even crazier. And I'm afraid trying to turn it into special pleading is counterproductive. And trying to say, oh, well, we went and talked to this small group of people and they say it's really important. Well, the government is charged with looking after everybody. And you know what ecologists think about butterflies is very clearly a minority sport, I'm afraid. And you have to relate the value of nature to society if you want society's decision makers to take notice of it.
There we go. That wraps up Module 2. I hope you found it interesting. Salvo, do you want to perhaps reiterate some of what you think are the most important points you would like students to come away with?
Sure, thank you, Martin. First point is, I hope you have an idea of what these methods are, how powerful they can be, and how we can make really good use of them. But I also hope you appreciate that there are situations in which these tools can also be misused, and therefore we need to be very aware of those conditions of limitations.
That's something that you mentioned in a previous sequence, but can you perhaps help the students understand specifically what they should be attentive to when they're reading a study or when they're reading a press article that mentions some monetary value?
Well, the first thing I think is to always make sure that the choice of the methods is very consistent with the thing we want to measure. So, in a sense, there are methods which are more generally applicable, but not necessarily the best method to use all the time. So the classic example is contingent valuation. Contingent valuation provides a terrific tool when we don't have other available methods. They are a terrific tool, for instance, to capture the existence value of a species. But if we want to, for instance, measure what is the value of reducing noise pollution or reduce air pollution, then we may be much better off by using an hedonic model where we can use the information coming from an existing functioning market.
One of the discussions that we've had internally, and especially with the leader of our next module, Juliet Fall, is whether monetizing things is even desirable. And I know that in private, when we were discussing the organization of this course, you said things in a certain way that I thought was interesting. Can you quickly state what you feel about the value or the potential danger of monetizations might be?
Well, this is a great question if, would have been asked 25 years ago. I mean, these days, every single international organization, government, big NGOs, environmental NGOs, they all majorly bought in valuation. So asking why we value things these days is probably not anymore a very timely question. And there is nothing implicitly right or wrong with using money or using a dollar sign or using a franc sign, if you like. We could use energy units, we can use anything, as long as we have a metric. And the importance of a metric is to be able to aggregate things which are very heterogeneous in nature. And the money does exactly that. Allows us to convert everything in one single measure that then is easy to sum up.
One of the things that I'm seeing within the IPBES, or the International Platform of Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity community, is people are arguing that monetization is fine, but it needs to be complemented with alternative approaches that perhaps can capture all those elements that cannot be converted reliably into one of these basic units. Would you agree with that statement?
Sure, of course. I mean, it's not the panacea for everything, but again, if we want to extract a value, then we need the unit of measurement, and then we can discuss which unit of measurement we want. But we can't escape from the need of the unit of measurement and identifying one. And money works well for that.
Great. Well, thanks for the material. Thanks
Pleasure.
for the good conversation. In our next module, we're going to have Professor Juliet Fall, who's going to talk about the normative dimensions to ecosystem services. She's a social geographer, and she's going to give us some tools to evaluate critically some of the perhaps biases that are built inherently into this entire approach.